Last time we talked about the three major domains of life, the eubacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya. And I'm going to come back to those in a couple of minutes, but I want to first talk about a few biological entities which really are not organisms, but are important ecosystems and particularly have some impact in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And so the first of these are prions, and prions are defined as infective proteins. And when we look at prions, there are two versions of proteins. There's the normal version, which I'm representing here by stars, and there's also an abnormal version, which I'm going to represent by a starburst. And so again, these prion proteins, we don't actually know what their normal function is, and they're found in brain cells, but we do know what happens when they become abnormal, and at least the downstream consequences of these prions, these infective prions. And so also what's interesting between the normal and the abnormal version is that they both have exactly the same amino acid sequence, but the abnormal version folds up into an abnormal shape, and that affects its function. And when we talked about proteins before, I did emphasize that amino acid sequence does normally impact protein shape and protein function. And again, here's kind of an unusual situation where you have two proteins the same amino acid sequence but different shapes. So what happens is that when these prion proteins form, they'll use an additional protein or an existing protein as kind of a scaffolding to ensure that they fold up the right way. And so anyway, these infective proteins, its infective prions then will be ingested. And when they associate with a normal protein, they will cause that normal protein to refold into an abnormal shape. And so then it becomes an abnormal prion protein. And then they, in turn, will associate with other normal proteins, cause them to refold into abnormal shapes, and so on and so on. And so this is a slowly progressing disease typically, but what happens then over time is that the normal prion proteins become this abnormal variety. The abnormal variety does not stay in solution in the cytoplasm, and so they will aggregate together, come out of solution, forming these brain plaques. And then these plaques in turn have neurotoxic effects, whether they directly are neurotoxic or whether they're the consequence of some other toxic effect is still, somewhat unknown. But regardless, these abnormal prion proteins then lead to death of the nerve cells, and then eventually our immune system comes in and cleans up the mess. And the effect is that we end up with what's known as a spongiform encephalopathy. Basically what it's saying is there's a pathology of the brain that makes the brain spongy. In other words, there's going to be holes in the brain, because if we're losing nerve cells or brain cells, then you've got a problem. So anyway, this then leads to abnormal behavior. The animals will be staggering around, they may not feed normally, and will eventually die. So we're going to refer to this class of diseases that are caused by prions in as spongiform encephalopathies. So this first appeared in sheep, and it's been known for quite a while in sheep. It's known as scrapie in sheep. And sheep parts used to be ground up and added to cattle feed, and we think that it jumped from sheep to cattle through that process, and it's known as mad cow disease or BSE for bovine spongiform encephalopathy. And then also there's a human variety of these diseases, which is known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and there's a genetic form, but there's also one that can be caught from ingesting prion proteins. And then also this has jumped probably from cattle, possibly from sheep, to wild populations of other ungulates like deer, elk, and moose. And in those animals, it's known as chronic wasting disease, CWD. And so this is the variety that is really problematic in the Yellowstone ecosystem, because again, this actually started in people who were raising deer and elk domestically for food. And anyway, it jumped from probably cattle or sheep to that population, and then from these domestic populations to wild populations. And so CWD, chronic wasting disease, has slowly kind of made its way from the East Coast west, and has appeared in the Yellowstone ecosystem. And just this last summer, for the first time, it appeared west of the Continental Divide in a moose. So there's a lot of concern about this, because this will affect management of elk, bison, and other ungulates in the ecosystem. And a really important economic driving force in management of the Yellowstone ecosystem happens to be the hunting lobby. You know, people like to hunt elk, so they want to preserve these elk populations. But elk get concentrated at certain times of the year during the winter when there are feed grounds established and so on, and they think that that's what leads to transmission of the disease from one animal to another. So we're gonna come back and talk about some of these management problems, but this is one area of definite concern. And then also, of course, if you have hunters that are killing animals that have prion diseases, chronic wasting disease, there's always the possibility it could jump to the human, and so there is concern about that. So again, we find this in deer populations, elk populations, moose, and it hasn't been identified in bison in the Yellowstone population yet, but there's the potential that it could jump to them as well, and again, a lot of concern about that. Okay, now another biological entity which isn't a classic organism are viruses. So viruses have some characteristics of organisms, but not all. And the way the viruses function is that viruses are composed primarily of a proteinaceous, sometimes lipid, protein and lipid coat, and then a core of genetic material, most typically DNA. And so what viruses cannot do is that they cannot reproduce themselves. They cannot metabolize for themselves. They don't take in energy, modify energy. But what they can do is attach to a target cell, and when they do, they'll inject in their DNA. And then they effectively take over the machinery of the cell so that the cell will make copies of the viral DNA. Then that DNA is transcribed and translated to produce the protein coats. The DNA is packaged in the protein coats that eventually ruptures the cell that they took over, killing that cell. The viruses are released, and then they have the potential to start the cycle over again with another cell. So we a lot of times look at viruses as being gene couriers in a sense, but not true organisms. So there are many viral diseases, but the ones that would be significant and are significant in the Yellowstone ecosystem and at times are potentially significant, one would certainly be influenza. There are many types of influenza. Of course, we suffer from influenza, but so do animals. In particular, avian influenzas, bird influenzas can be pretty significant and have a significant impact on populations. Another virus which has shown up in the area is West Nile virus. West Nile virus is transmitted from organism to organism by mosquitoes. And this also has a high mortality in birds, particularly crows and some of the crow relatives like gray jay and so on. So West Nile virus is really severe among birds. Humans can also get West Nile virus, and so if you travel to the area, you certainly don't want to be bitten by mosquitoes. You want to avoid that. And it also is problematic with some other animals, horses, for example. Now, rabies is not a major problem in the area, but we do find rabies all across the United States. A lot of the carnivorous animals potentially can pick up rabies, so there's always concern about this, for example, in management of wolves. But members of the weasel family that we find up there also will suffer low levels of rabies. Bats potentially can have rabies as well. But I wouldn't say rabies is any more of a problem in the Yellowstone ecosystem than anywhere else, but it is a type of viral disease. Now, distemper has been problematic. This is a viral disease that we find in dogs. It affects a lot of different systems, the digestive system, respiratory system, and so on, and usually has a high mortality rate. And this can jump from domestic dogs, and has jumped from domestic dogs to wolf populations and coyote populations in the past. And a few years ago, it did have a big impact on the pups. In 1 year, about 25% of the pups died from a combination of distemper and also parvo, which is another really nasty virus. Parvo is what we call a hemorrhagic virus. It actually causes just a really horrible diarrhea, a bleeding diarrhea, and basically the animals bleed out through their intestines. So also that has been problematic periodically with the wolf population. So again, a couple of years ago, the wolf population had a combination of distemper and parvo, and it wiped out, like I said, about 25% of the pups. Now, getting back to our true organisms then, and some of these then we're going to look at the diversity of life in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and we're going to address organisms that we find in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So again, looking at our three major domains, eubacteria, archaea, and eukarya, I first want to look at the two prokaryotic domains, the eubacteria and the archaea. And so when we classify prokaryotes, a lot of our classification depends on genetic analysis. Because prokaryotes are very, very small, they don't really have, even though I'm going to talk about morphology, it's hard to really consider their morphology in a lot of detail in some situations. So we're interested a lot of times in what the genetic makeup of organisms are among the prokaryotes, again, looking at the eubacteria and the archaea. Also their biochemistry can be very handy in trying to classify the organisms. So when we talk about biochemical pathways or biochemistry in general, one of the things we'll look at is cell wall composition. We'll also look at biochemical pathways. We've talked a little bit about this already, whether the bacteria, or excuse me, whether the prokaryotes are heterotrophic or autotrophic, their oxygen tolerance. Also, what kind of toxins they may or may not produce. If they produce a toxin, is it an exotoxin or an endotoxin? An exotoxin is actually a chemical produced by the prokaryote for export, which potentially has toxic effects. An endotoxin is something that is potentially toxic to the host, but is a part of the structure of the prokaryote. So it might be a component of the capsule, or it might be a component of the cell wall. And then as these prokaryotes die, the cell wall and capsule fragments gets carried through the bloodstream of the animal, and it's actually those cellular components which are toxic. Also, what we call limiting nutrients. By growing bacteria in laboratory settings, we can determine what nutrients they need, for perhaps certain forms of nitrogen that they need, or they may need certain sugars to grow, that kind of thing. And we can classify according to their specific metabolism based on what they need to live. And then a variety of other biochemical measures as well. We also will look at colony characteristics. So when we grow prokaryotes on agar plates or in in laboratory settings, the types of groupings that they form will be very characteristic. So sometimes we don't even have to look at the specific types of bacteria. If we can determine what they need to grow and what their colonies look like, that alone can sometimes tell us what kind of bacterium or archaean that we're dealing with. And then last but not least, we do look at, and in terms of this also, some will form biofilms. So some will associate with one another and form coatings on surfaces. And we do see some of this in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and a lot of the hot springs, we'll see these bacterial mats formed in some of the hot springs. And then also morphology. So I'm going to talk about morphology, but part of the problem with morphology in prokaryotes is that they are so small, it's a lot of times hard to get a good feel of their morphology. But nonetheless, that's something that I will be discussing in a second. So looking at that then, what are some of the physical structure that we do see among prokaryotes? And again, we're talking about both eubacteria and archaea in this situation. So some of them we describe as being cocci, and a coccus is singular here. These are spherical bacteria. And the streptococci would be, and so again, spherical bacteria are cocci. Streptococci would be spherical bacteria that form chains, straight chains, or sometimes branching chains. Staphylococci would be spherical bacteria that form clusters or clumps, and that's also a genus of bacteria. So you may have heard of, if you've had strep throat, you had a strep infection. If you've ever had a staph infection of the skin, that's the type of bacteria that was causing that. And then some of the spherical bacteria will be in pairs. So diplococci would be, describes that kind of condition. Gonorrhea is actually a disease that is a diplococcus. And then some bacteria are rod-shaped, and the term for that is bacillus. So a rod-shaped bacteria is known as a bacillus. And this is a stain of some bacteria. But again, this gives you a sense of how tiny bacteria are. I mean, we're, again, typically talking about 2 or 3 micrometers. And so looking at this, it's hard to tell if that speck is a bacillus or a coccus. Also, there are spiral bacteria, spirilla. And the spirilla, what distinguishes them is, again, they will have a spiral shape, but they do have flagellae that are free. And so these will spin around and can propel the organism through body fluids or through water. And that contrasts with another type of spiral bacteria that we find in nature, which are spirochetes. Spirochetes also have a spiral structure to them, but instead of having free flagella that spin around, the flagellum actually is embedded in the cell wall and comes back over the organism itself. And so as the flagellum attempts to spin, it actually causes a contraction and expansion of the bacterium. And so as it expands and contracts, it allows the organism to move in a spiral manner over surfaces. And so the spirochetes are kind of a notorious group, not so much just in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but in general, because they cause some kind of interesting diseases. One of these would be Lyme disease. Lyme disease, fortunately, is not endemic to the Yellowstone ecosystem, but we do find it in the east, particularly east of the Mississippi, and that's a tick-borne disease. But spirochetes hide pretty easily from the immune system, so once you get these spirochete diseases, they're pretty hard to get rid of, and you can literally have them for years or decades if you're not aware that you're infected. Syphilis actually is another example of a spirochete disease in humans. And then another shape that we look at or consider when we're trying to classify would be Vibrio. And so Vibrio just means a comma-shaped bacterium or archaean. And again, there are other considerations as well in prokaryotic classification, but these are some of the major things that we look at. Now, when we look at prokaryotes and how they divide, most of them divide in a mitosis-like kind of division, an asexual type of process, and this is known as binary fission. And so you may recall that prokaryotes have a circular chromosome, and so what they'll do is copy that chromosome, and then they typically will grow at a point between those two chromosomes, and as the cell expands, it will separate the chromosomes. And then the last step is just to go ahead and build in a new cell wall and cell membrane, and we end up with two daughter cells that are genetically identical to one another and genetically identical to the original cell. So again, this is known as binary fission. So it's a simpler process than what we have in mitotic division among eukaryotes. Now, prokaryotes are also capable of a sexual process, and we refer to this as conjugation. And so in addition, again, you may recall that in prokaryotes, in addition to the circular chromosome, they will have other smaller loops of DNA typically, and we call these plasmids. And so if a prokaryote has the right kind of plasmid, it can initiate a sexual process between it and an adjacent bacterium. And so they'll build what's called a conjugation tube between it and its neighbor. And then the plasmid will copy itself. The plasmid will be transported to the other cell and reform there. And so again, genetic material can be transported from one bacterium or archaean to another. And again, we look at this as a form of sexual process. There can also be an exchange of genetic material if they both have the right kind of plasmid. So it can be a one-way transfer of genetic information or a swap of genetic information. So what's interesting about conjugation is that if you went back 20, 30 years, we used to think that bacteria had to be very closely related to conjugate with one another. And what we have since learned is that prokaryotes don't have to be closely related. In fact, even eubacterians can conjugate with archaeans. So among the prokaryotes, there's a lot of swapping of genetic material that's going on there. And it makes it very difficult to elucidate evolutionary relationship, because normally when we look at evolution, we're looking at shared genes and what we call vertical transmission. So genetic material going from generation to generation to generation, as it would in binary fission in this particular situation. But in conjugation, we also have what we call horizontal transfer. And so again, archaeans and eubacteria and archaeans can freely exchange DNA among one another. And so it doesn't translate very well to looking at common ancestry when we see shared genes, since relatively unrelated organisms can share DNA in these situations. So this is kind of one of the exceptions to that. It's very difficult to figure out evolutionary relationships among the prokaryotes. And so again, it just kind of makes it difficult to kind of figure out exactly what the relationships are here. But again, there's enough shared genes for us to know that there is a common ancestry between among these organisms, as we've talked about already. But it's hard to figure out the specifics. Okay, now, as we look at eubacteria then, so looking at the domain eubacteria, again, they're prokaryotic, they have other characteristics, but really is what's going to distinguish them from the archaeans is that they are not only prokaryotic, but they have unique cell walls. And in particular, their cell walls contain a material known as peptidoglycans, which is a sugar protein or sugar amino acid combination. And so when we look at this peptidoglycans in the cell wall, some eubacterians we describe as being gram-positive. The gram-positive bacteria have a very thick layer of peptidoglycans in the cell wall, and so this would be the plasma membrane inside of the cell here, the cell membrane, and then the cell wall here, so a thick layer of peptidoglycans. And so when we stain them with a stain known as the gram stain, then they will stain purple. So the purple bacteria here are examples of gram-positive bacteria. And then there are gram-negative bacteria. Gram-negative bacteria have a much thinner layer of peptidoglycans, and again in the cell wall, and then they typically have another membrane external to the cell membrane. So they'll have the inside of the cell here, they're going to have a cell membrane, they're going to have a thin cell wall of peptidoglycans, and then still another membrane external to that. And in the staining technique, if you use the same staining technique here, they end up staining kind of a pinkish or reddish color. So the gram-negative bacteria, pink or red, gram-positive bacteria, purple. Now, looking at some of the eubacterians that are specific to the Yellowstone ecosystem, they're not only found there, but which we do consider and do find in the Yellowstone ecosystem. We'll start with a group known as the endospore-forming bacteria. And so the endospore-forming bacteria have the ability to form a spore. And this is a term that I'll be using many times in the rest of the course. And a spore basically is a cell that has a protective wall around it. It usually can tolerate drying out, desiccation. Sometimes a spore will be able to tolerate changes in pH. Also, they may be able to tolerate high temperature. And so in this particular case, the endospore-forming bacteria, the spores are very heat tolerant, acid tolerant, and can dry out. In some cases can live for years and years. And so this, again, is a kind of a dormant stage in which the cell is not actively dividing or anything when it forms a spore. And so a couple examples. One is Clostridium. Clostridium causes botulism poisoning in canned foods, but botulism can also occur in nature. And so it's not common, but it is out there. So occasionally you'll have animals that are getting exposed to some food that has had Clostridium growing in it, and Clostridium produces a toxin then which will kill the animals. And then another example of an endospore former is Bacillus. Now Bacillus bacteria are very, very common, but there are some pathogenic types of Bacillus, a form that actually causes anthrax, which we're very concerned about. And so again, this Bacillus anthracis is problematic because, again, the spores can live for decades, and this potentially can kill livestock, also kills ungulates, deer, elk, and so on. So we haven't had a real big problem in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but occasionally they do come across and find anthrax in the ecosystem. But again, it hasn't really been a major problem to this point. Now, again, we're working within the domain Eukarya here, and I haven't really defined these groups, but we're pretty much going to look at these groups as being like kingdoms. We can look at gram-positive and gram-negative as being, super kingdoms of organisms, and now we're just going to be talking about kingdoms of eubacteria. So again, one of those were the endospore formers, and another of those will be a group that includes the bacteria that causes Brucella, so the Brucella-causing bacteria. And Brucella is also a genus, and it causes brucellosis. Brucellosis is a chronic problem in the Yellowstone ecosystem. When humans pick up brucellosis, it's referred to as undulant fever, and typically in humans it causes a flu-like condition. But brucellosis is a problem because it's something, again, that we find among the hoofed mammals in the ecosystem, so we'll see it among elk and deer. Bison also pick up brucellosis. Elk, like I said before, in particular. And among the elk and bison populations, what brucellosis does, or what Brucella does, is that it causes abortions, especially the first time that they're pregnant. So it'll cause the animal to spontaneously abort its fetus. Now, again, it's not really a major problem in the ecosystem because both elk and bison populations historically have grown dramatically. But where it becomes a management problem in the ecosystem is that both elk and bison encounter cattle. And so there is the potential to transmit brucellosis from elk and bison to cattle. And that's actually how they got it. They picked it up from cattle in overlapping ranges. And so there's a lot of energy that goes into managing the bison, but there's not that much energy that goes into managing the elk. But it is something that we'll be talking about because this is problematic for the economic interest of ranchers in the area. They don't want a lot of exposure between bison and cattle, and they want limited exposure between elk and cattle. And again, there's been a lot of attention attributed to the bison, and part of that reason is that there's no hunting season on bison. Bison are not hunted, so it doesn't bring in a lot of hunters to the area. But elk do have a hunting season. They do bring in a lot of money to the area, so people kind of ignore the elk and focus on the bison. And again, we'll talk about this later, but it's kind of a bogus way to manage brucellosis. But this is a chronic problem in the ecosystem. Now, enteric bacteria are bacteria that we find in the intestines of organisms. So virtually all animals in the Yellowstone ecosystem are going to have bacteria there. And some are helpful, some are harmful, some are pathogenic, and some you have to be able to live normally. Same thing in our gut. About a seventh of the mass of our feces actually is bacteria. So we have bacteria that live in our gut. They actually help us absorb vitamins and actually digest some materials as well. And the same is true of all of the organisms in the Yellowstone ecosystem. So probably the most famous member of the group is E. coli, Escherichia coli. And there is a very notorious pathogen, E. coli, H70157. And this is the one that really is potentially deadly to humans. And so this E. coli variety can be endemic. It can be living in the gut of animals throughout the Yellowstone ecosystem and throughout all ecosystems, quite honestly. And they can tolerate it, but it is potentially deadly for us. So when you travel the Yellowstone ecosystem, you'll be in some beautiful places. The water will look pristine, and you may be tempted to think, well, I can drink out of that stream, it will be no big deal. But you could pick up E. coli almost anywhere in the ecosystem, and you just don't want to take that kind of gamble, because it's not just E. coli. There are other potential pathogens in the water as well. So there's really no safe water to drink in the Yellowstone ecosystem, even though it looks like it should be safe. And E. coli are kind of a classic, like I said, enteric gram-negative bacterium. Now, also spirochetes, the spirocheta, again, would be another kingdom that we would consider here. And spirocheta are not a major problem in the ecosystem. As I mentioned before, we associate spirochetes with Lyme disease. And fortunately, Lyme disease is not a real problem in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Again, this is a tick-borne disease, and we just don't find the right kind of ticks there. Also, we don't find the right kind of intermediate host to make this a problem there. But I would say, though, and I mention it here, though, because in a lot of parts of the country, it is a major problem. It's something you want to avoid. And even in the Yellowstone ecosystem, even though the ticks are not loaded with lots of problematic bacteria, you just don't want to get bitten by ticks in general. Because, again, they can be carrying some other things, and I'll be talking about some of those in a little bit. So, again, ticks also are not a huge problem in the Yellowstone ecosystem, but they're there. And so when you do hike in the Yellowstone ecosystem, you always want to check for ticks when you get back or when you take a rest. Okay, I'm going to continue with more eubacteria next time. That's it for today.